Hello everyone, welcome to React Advanced tutorial. In this tutorial we will talk about TypeScript. If you hear lightning in background, it's raining here. Sorry about that. So what we learn here, we will talk about why we use TypeScript, and we will see how to use TypeScript, and then we will talk about different types of TypeScript. So the first question is, what is TypeScript? The TypeScript is a language that is written on top of JavaScript. And it means that whatever you know in JavaScript, and if you type or if you write in JavaScript code, you should be fine. It's basically a JavaScript code, but very explicitly about types of the objects. And if you think about it, it's more disciplined. The TypeScript is more disciplined than JavaScript. In JavaScript, you can just define a variable with any type, and the compiler will not give you any error. But TypeScript is very strict, and it will give you some error at the compile time, and it will help you avoiding some bugs at compile time rather than runtime. So we can give an example here. If you see the left hand side, we have some dynamically typed languages, and the example here is JavaScript, Ruby, Python, and etc. And in this dynamically typed language, it means that if you define a variable like this, let name Harry, and you're basically putting this name type as string. And if you in the second line change the name value to an integer or number, and you will not get any kind of compiler, the ID or anything will not give you any error because it's dynamically typed and you can change it at any time. But if you use one of the string method, which is substring, this method in strings is just, you can concatenate or you can reduce or slice any string from the original string. So this method is only available for string, but since you change it to number, it will get confused and it will not give you error at the compile time, but when you run the application, your application will crash. In order to avoid it, we use TypeScript, and TypeScript is like statically typed language like Java, C#, C++. These are the languages that are statically typed. They explicitly say what is my type for this variable, and later on you should just stick to that type. For example, if you say the string name and the type of this variable is string, then in the next line if you put it to number, it will give you error at compile time. It will not let you go forward. That is the reason that we use TypeScript versus JavaScript, in order to reduce the runtime error and avoid the first step of using TypeScript is to set up your application with TypeScript. How do we do that? We basically learned it in very first episode of the first season of React development. I think the Hello World application, we set the Create React app with the TypeScript. That was the time that we set it up, and I promised you that I will talk about types later, and this is the time. So if you go back to that tutorial, so you know how to set up your application so you can use TypeScript. We need that compiler in order to translate TypeScript into JavaScript behind the scene. And the setup that we showed on the first episode of that season will teach you how to do that. So I will not go through it. If you want it, you can go watch it later. But during the setup time, it automatically adds this tsconfig file to your project into the root directory. And what it does, it basically adds some of the configuration. I will not go through the configuration. You can just Google it and find out what is it good for. But it is good for our application. I will not change any settings here, but you can change later. You can add stuff into it from the documentation of the TypeScript. It's not necessary, but based on your needs later, you can add or remove the settings I just wanted to show you where the settings are located in your application, and if you need it, where to find it. But in order to give some example and show you different types of TypeScript, I will use one of the components that we have for application, which is currently empty. In the home page, I have nothing there, but I can just give you some example of types in TypeScript. Okay, let's see some TypeScript in action. If I define a variable like this, this is my variable name, unknown type, and I added equal to John, so basically to some string. And now in the second line, if I come and say, put this variable equal to an array, and let's see, you see that it adds some error underneath it. And if I zoom in, you'll see that assigned expression type, which is this array of number, is not assignable to type string. And this is the compile time error that I was talking about. So we get compile time error that this type doesn't match with this one. But if I change this one to some string like hello, you'll see the error is gone, and it will avoid any kind of bugs during the compile time. So now the next cool feature about TypeScript is that, as you can see here, I didn't explicitly mention the type, but it knows that it's string. But if I want to explicitly type it, I can just put colon and then say string. So that's how we define the types. Oh, sorry. If I want to define a variable for numbers, I would definitely say, I would call it inferred type. Inferred type. I call this as an inferred, and this one type is number, and it's equal to, for example, number 2. If I can type inferred, so I can just say inferred type equal to, and if I remove this number, it will be fine because it is smart enough to recognize this is a number and it assign a number to this type. So the next one that I would like to show is type array. So if we have type array, and inside of this array we have numbers, you can just definitely say something like this. You can say const or maybe let. It doesn't matter. If you want to change it later, you can just do let. And I call it array type. This is the name of the variable, and I give it some initial value. I say it's equal to empty array, and that's how you give the type for array. If the items inside of your array are not number or string, you can just add it string. If you have some boolean type there, you can just call it boolean based on your need. If it's mixed, you cannot explicitly say any of these types because it will give you error. For example, if you have some 1, 2, and then 7, and then you have some string here, see, it will give you error. It says the type is boolean. What are you talking about? You added string, but the type is boolean. What should we do here? We can just add any. So what does any mean? It means that items inside of this array could be any type. It's not recommended to add any wherever we see some error, because it will again go back to vanilla JavaScript and not typed. So we're trying to avoid these kind of things. So that's the basic types that we have: numbers, string, boolean, and we'll go further and find. So far we've learned how to add type for a variable like this. So we just colon and the type of that variable. But what if we have a variable function? So something like this, const and a function type. I call this function type, and this function is basically something like this. It returns, it is a function, and it returns a number. For example, in this case, number 0. How do we add type for this? The answer is very simple. Like the other variables, it's the same, but we can just do colon, and we can just add a function signature, and then since it's returning a number, we can just say this is something that is returning something. But if it was not returning something, we can just simply say void. So I can just remove this return value, and this will be the type of this function, basically this one. So it says function, there is a function that returns nothing. But if I want to, for example, return a string, if this function was returning a string, see it complains and it says that it's not returning anything. So I have to just return a string here, some string or some text basically. So that's how you give the type for the functions. But now how about a function with argument? So if I just, for example, a function with argument like this, I can call it const function with argument type, and I would like to give argument in this. So we had it in from the previous one that it's send string, and it is equal to basically this one. You can just copy paste the previous one, but this one has argument and this input, and the input type is also string. So let's remove this doesn't matter, but it just returns the string. And now it has a string as an input or argument. We give it a type and we say that, okay, this function basically receives an argument and then it returns something like string. And now I want to call this function. If I call this function, try to call it, you'll see there is some error here because it says invalid number of argument, expected 1 argument. So if I go back and check, and you see that it compile error time. It says, oh, you have not passed anything inside of this argument, but as soon as I pass something, the error will gone. That's again the good feature of TypeScript, that it will check for any arguments that you missed, and also it checks for the type of that. Let's do the next type. Okay, sometimes the type that you want to define is not as simple as just string, boolean, or number. For example, it's an object. So how do you do that? I'll first define the object that I have in mind and say, for example, I have an object that is equal to, it's kind of like an ID and name. So how do I define a type for this object? How we can define it? It's very simple. Like the others, first we have to put colon, and then we should open an object. Since it's an object, we can just say the type is also look like an object, and we can give it exactly what we have for the value. So the type of ID is number, which we have number here, and the type of name is string. So that's how it knows, okay, so the type of his object type is to property, and the property 1 is type number, and property 2 is type name. And it can get really ugly if we have an object with a lot of properties. So there's a shorter version of it, and we can just call it alias type. So you can name it, like you can call it type, and you can call it type student. And I put the capital S because this is a type name, and I can just add it equal to the one that we just defined, something like this. And now we can do some cool thing like saying alias type const. If we want to define something like this, we can just have it a shorthanded version and call it like alias type, and the type is basically the student, the one that we defined here. So we don't need to type the whole thing here. We can just use the name that we defined here and add it equal to whatever number that we need to do. So it will first avoid the duplication of the code, because the next time that I want to define another variable, I don't need to define the type. I can just use the student. And the second, it just gives more readability comparing to this type definition. That we will learn is union type. What is it? For example, you have a variable or a function. I'll call it union type. You have a function that it receives height, and then it returns some value. It's basically a function, but it gets height, and you want to give it a type, and this height could sometimes be string and sometimes be number. So how do we define that? If we just add number, it will give us compile error if we add if we send string to it. So the best way and the union type way is to add a pipe and then say string. So this means height can get number and string, and you can just add a logic for yourself that if the type of number, something like the type of, so yeah, type of height is equal something like that, is equal to number, do this, else do some other calculation. But that's the union type. Okay, the next concept that we will learn is intersection type. What is it? So for example, you define two types. For example, type A gives an ID, and type B includes the name. And now you want to define a variable that includes both of them. So how do we do that? I'll call it intersection. And this, I can just first show you what I mean, that I want to put what inside of it. So I want to put both ID and name inside of this function or this variable. How do I type it? Using these two types, I can just simply add A and B. So that's how you type it. Intersect means that combine these two, and it will give you a new type, which is both of these ID and name. If I remove any of them, you will see an error, and it says that it requires the other type as well. So that's the compile error time that you will get, and that's all about intersection. Okay, the last but not least concept that we will learn is optional. I would suggest to pay attention because it's very important. So I add a type like the student that we had, but added one more field to it. So we had ID and number, remember the type that we defined before. I added one more field to it. Basically it's another object, and it stores the preferences of the students. So for example, what are the preference of their location, what is the preference of their weather, and it could be a nested object as well. But basically it's exactly like the other objects, that it gets the name and also the type. And now I would like to pass this object into a function. So I can just define a function here and say const, and I just call it optional argument for function. Optional argument for function. This is just a random name that I selected. You can add any name that you want. And this function, this is the signature of the function, so let me finish the function. This function receives two arguments. The first one is called student, And the second argument, I can just pass graduate year. So basically this function gets two arguments, and the first one is student, this object, and the second one is graduate year. So I want to give type to these two arguments. I can just simply give this one student type, and give this one, since it's a year, I can just give it a number. And then I can call this function with some variable. Currently it gives me error. If I just try to call it, it says invalid number of arguments. It expects two arguments. I have to pass two arguments. So let's define a student variable first. I can just define a variable and gives all of the item that we have for the type, like the ID, the name, preferences, and all of this. So I can pass this one as the first argument, but it still gives me error. Why? Because it says, okay, so it has two arguments, but you give only one. So I have to pass the second argument in order to remove the error. And since the type is number, I can just give it 2022, and now there's no error. But what if we don't have the year, or we don't want to pass the year? What should we do here? It still gives us an error if we don't send it. That's the optional concept that comes into picture. So in order to show that one of the arguments are optional, you can just simply put question mark right next to it. And as soon as I put the question mark here, the error went away. See, there is no error here. And that's how I put optional. I can just put it for here as well, but this one was the one that was causing error. It will be the same for the objects here, for the type that we defined here. For example, I can just put preference as an optional, and the rest of them are mandatory. So for example, if my student here doesn't have preference, then you see the error will come back here. It says that this type doesn't match with the type that we have here, because this preference is missing from this object. What should I do? How can I resolve this? I can either add the preference, but if I don't have the preference here, I can make this one optional. So as soon as I put this one optional, it means that they can provide it, or if they don't want to provide it, they're fine. So this error will went away. So that's the optional concept comes into